got the promotion, you're in a stable relationship, your bills are paid, your health is good. By every objective measure, your life is going well, maybe even great. And yet when you wake up in the morning, there's this hollow feeling in your chest, this quiet emptiness that makes no sense, because you have everything you're supposed to want. So why does it feel like you have nothing at all? Maybe you've tried to ignore it. You've told yourself to be grateful, to focus on the positive, to remember how hard you worked to get here. But the emptiness doesn't care about your gratitude. It sits there, undeniable, whispering a question you're terrified to answer. Is this all there is? You achieved the goals. You checked the boxes. You did everything right. And somehow, it wasn't enough. Somehow, success feels like the most sophisticated form of failure you've ever experienced. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, understood this paradox better than almost anyone. He spent years in concentration camps, places of unimaginable suffering, and discovered something that would revolutionize psychology. He found that the people who survived weren't necessarily the strongest or healthiest. They were the ones who had a reason to survive, a meaning that pulled them forward. And when he returned to the world and began treating patients, he encountered a different kind of suffering. People with comfortable lives, successful careers, loving families, who felt profoundly empty. He called it the existential vacuum. And he realized that humans can endure almost any suffering if they have meaning. But comfort without meaning is its own form of hell. Carl Jung would recognize your emptiness immediately. He'd tell you that what you've achieved is what he called persona success. You've become what society told you to become. You've built a life that looks good from the outside. But yourself, your true nature, is starving. Because you've been so busy meeting external expectations that you forgot to ask what you actually want, what actually matters, who you actually are beneath the achievements. And Søren Kierkegaard, that prophet of existential despair, would say you're experiencing what he called the sickness unto death. Not physical death, but spiritual death. The despair of having everything except yourself, of being successful at a life that isn't actually yours, of waking up one day and realizing you've spent years becoming someone you don't even recognize. Today, we're going to explore why success can feel like emptiness, why having everything can somehow feel like having nothing, why the life you worked so hard to build can feel like a prison. Because Frankl, Jung, and Kierkegaard all understood something that modern culture refuses to admit. Achievement is not the same as fulfillment. Success is not the same as meaning. And you can win at life while losing yourself completely. Let me start with something Viktor Frankl discovered that changes everything. He called it Sunday neurosis. It's the phenomenon where people who are perfectly fine during the work week, busy and productive and functional, fall apart on Sunday, when there's nothing to do, when there's no external structure demanding their attention, when they're forced to be alone with themselves, and suddenly, the emptiness they've been running from all week rushes in like a flood. Frankl realized this wasn't about Sundays. It was about what happens when external distractions stop. When achievement isn't available to fill the void, when you can't hide behind productivity. And what emerges in that space is what he called the existential vacuum, the absence of meaning, the hollow place where your why should be. Think about your own life. When are you most aware of the emptiness? Probably not when you're busy, not when you're working towards something, not when you're distracted by obligations and goals. It's in the quiet moment, the Sunday mornings, the vacations that are supposed to be relaxing but feel unsettling, the moments of success when you thought you'd feel joy, but instead feel nothing. That's when the vacuum reveals itself. because you've achieved everything except the one thing that actually matters, a reason for it all. Frankl saw this pattern everywhere. Successful professionals who had nervous breakdowns after retirement, wealthy people who fell into depression despite having every material comfort, young people who achieved their dream jobs and immediately felt disillusioned. And what all of them had in common was this: they'd spent their lives chasing goals without ever asking why those goals mattered. They'd climbed the ladder without questioning whether it was leaning against the right wall. And here's what Frankl understood that most people miss: happiness cannot be pursued. It can only ensue. It's a byproduct of living meaningfully. But meaning, that's something you have to choose. Something you have to create. And if you spent your whole life chasing externally defined success, checking boxes someone else drew, achieving goals someone else valued, then you arrive at success empty, because you were never filling the vacuum. You were just covering it with achievements. Jung would take this further. He'd say what you're experiencing is the crisis of the persona. You've built this perfect external self, the successful professional, the good partner, the responsible adult. And everyone sees that persona and thinks you're thriving. But inside, your true self is suffocating, because the persona is an adaptation. It's the version of you that's acceptable to society. And you've become so good at being that version that you've forgotten who you actually are. This is why success can trigger such profound emptiness, because success validates the persona. It proves that your adaptation worked. And the moment you realize that, the moment you achieve everything your persona wanted, you're faced with a terrifying question: who am I when I'm not performing? Who am I when I'm not achieving? Who am I underneath this successful person everyone sees? And often the answer is, I don't know, because you buried that person years ago. The first sign: you achieved someone else's dream, not yours. Here's the first truth about emptiness in success. What you built, the life that looks so good on paper, probably isn't actually yours. It's a life constructed from external expectations, what your parents wanted, what society values, what would make you look successful to others. But somewhere in the process of building it, you stopped asking whether it's what you wanted. Frankl talked about this constantly. He'd see patients who had everything society said would make them happy, and they were miserable. And when he'd ask them to describe their purpose, their meaning, they couldn't, because they'd never asked themselves that question. They'd just followed the script. Get educated, get a career, get married, buy a house. And then they arrived at the end of the script and realized, this wasn't written for me. This was written for someone else. And I've been performing their dream, not living mine. Think about the major decisions in your life: your career, your relationship, where you live, how you spend your time. How many of those decisions were truly yours? How many were based on what you thought you should do versus what you actually wanted? How many were about looking successful versus being fulfilled? And now you're living the result of those choices, and it looks good, but it feels empty because it's not actually yours. Jung would say you've achieved ego success, but self-failure. Your ego, the conscious part that wants approval and achievement, is satisfied. You did what you were supposed to do. You became what you were supposed to become. But yourself, the deeper truth of who you are, is starving, because the self doesn't care about external validation. It cares about authenticity, about living in alignment with your true nature. And you've spent years doing the opposite. Kierkegaard called this the aesthetic life. It's the life of achievement and pleasure and external success. It looks beautiful from the outside, but it's fundamentally empty because it has no ethical core, no authentic commitment, no real choice, You're just following the path of least resistance, doing what's expected, collecting achievements like trophies. And eventually, you wake up and realize the trophies are meaningless, because they were never about you. They were about performing a version of success for an audience that doesn't even know you. The second sign: you're terrified of stopping, because that's when you feel it. Here's another pattern Frankl identified. People who feel this emptiness become addicted to busyness, not because they love what they're doing, but because stopping means feeling. And what they'd feel is the void, so they stay busy. They fill every moment. They achieve and achieve and achieve. Not because the achievements matter, but because achievement is the anesthetic. Think about your relationship with rest. Can you actually relax? Or does relaxation make you anxious? Do vacations feel good? Or do they feel unsettling? When you have free time, do you enjoy it? Or do you immediately try to fill it? Because if rest feels dangerous, if emptiness only becomes visible when you stop moving, then you're not living. You're running. And what you're running from is the realization that your life, successful as it is, doesn't actually mean anything to you. Frankl saw this in his patients constantly. They'd work 80-hour weeks, not because they loved their work, but because work was the only thing keeping them from confronting the emptiness. They'd schedule every moment, not because they were passionate about their activities, but because an empty calendar meant facing themselves. And themselves they'd spent years avoiding. Jung called this inflation. It's when the ego becomes so identified with external achievement that it mistakes activity for meaning. You're not successful because you're living meaningfully. You're successful because you're terrified of what you'd discover if you stopped. And the busier you get, the more achievements you collect, the emptier you feel, because you're papering over a void with accomplishments. And no amount of paper can fill a hole. This is why the emptiness often becomes unbearable after major achievements. You finally got the promotion you worked years for, and you thought you'd feel satisfied. But instead, you feel nothing, or worse, you feel panic, because you just reached the goal that was supposed to make everything worthwhile. And it didn't. And now you don't have the next achievement to chase. And that means you have to face the question you've been avoiding. What's the point? The third sign: you feel like you're living someone else's life. Now we're getting to what Kierkegaard called the despair of not wanting to be oneself. It's the most sophisticated form of despair. You're not dramatically suffering. You're not falling apart. You're functioning perfectly. But you're functioning as someone you're not. You're living a life that works, but it's not your life. And that disconnection, that constant sense of playing a role, creates a hollow ache nothing can fill. Jung understood this as the crisis of the persona overwhelming the self. You've become so good at being who you're supposed to be that you've lost contact with who you actually are. You perform your role flawlessly: the successful professional, the good partner, the responsible adult. But underneath the performance, you're screaming. Because every day you maintain the persona is another day you betray yourself. Think about how you feel when you're alone, not distracted by work or responsibilities, just alone with your thoughts. Do you feel at home in yourself? Or do you feel like a stranger? When you think about your daily life, does it feel like yours? Or does it feel like you're an actor playing a part in someone else's story? Because that feeling, that sense of disconnection from your own existence, that's the emptiness. That's yourself trying to get your attention, trying to tell you that success without authenticity is just elaborate self-abandonment. Frankl would say you're living without a why. You have the what, all the external markers of success. And you have the how, you know how to maintain that success. But you don't have the why. You don't know why any of it matters. Why you get up in the morning, why you do what you do, Why this particular life versus any other? And without that why, everything feels meaningless. Because it is. Meaning isn't something you find in achievement. It's something you create through authentic commitment to what actually matters to you. Kierkegaard would challenge you to ask, whose values am I living? Whose dreams am I pursuing? Whose approval am I seeking? Because if the answer isn't yours, if you're living according to someone else's script, then despair is inevitable. Because you can be incredibly successful at a life that has nothing to do with who you actually are. And that success, impressive as it looks, will feel hollow. Because it's not yours. It never was. The fourth sign. You're waiting for the next thing to make you feel alive. Here's another pattern all three thinkers would recognize. When you feel empty despite success, you start telling yourself, it'll be better when I get the next promotion, when I move to the bigger house, when I reach the next milestone. You're always deferring fulfillment to the future, because admitting that achievement doesn't actually create meaning would force you to question everything you've built. Frankl called this the provisional existence. It's the pattern of living as if your real life will start later, after you achieve X, after you reach Y, after you finally arrive at some imagined destination where everything will suddenly make sense. But it never does. Because meaning doesn't wait at the end of achievement. It has to be woven into the present. And you've spent so long postponing your actual life that you've forgotten how to live it. Think about your relationship with the present moment. Are you here? Or are you always looking ahead to the next thing? When you achieve something, do you feel satisfied? Or do you immediately start chasing the next goal? Because if you're constantly future-focused, constantly waiting for the next thing to fill the emptiness, then you're admitting something you don't want to admit. What you have isn't enough. And what you're chasing won't be either. Because you're trying to solve an existential problem with material solutions. And it doesn't work. Jung saw this in his midlife crisis patients constantly. They'd spent the first half of life achieving, building careers, families, identities, and they were good at it. But then they'd hit 40, 50, and suddenly the formula stopped working. The achievements that used to feel meaningful felt hollow. The goals that used to motivate felt arbitrary. And they'd come to him desperate, saying, I have everything I wanted, why don't I feel anything? And he'd tell them, because you achieved the ego's goals, not the self's. You became successful at being someone else's idea of you, and now your true self is demanding to be heard. Kierkegaard would say you're trapped in what he called infinite resignation. You've resigned yourself to the idea that meaning comes from external achievement, that fulfillment is always just one more success away. But it's not. Meaning requires what Kierkegaard called the leap of faith. Not religious faith necessarily, but existential faith. The courage to commit to something that matters to you, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else. Even if it means abandoning some of the success you've worked for. Even if it means admitting that what you built isn't actually what you wanted. The fifth sign. Deep down, you're grieving for the life you didn't live. Here's the final and most painful truth. The emptiness you feel isn't just about what you have. It's about what you don't have. It's about the roads not taken, the dreams abandoned, the authentic self you buried to become acceptable. You're grieving, and you can't even admit it because you're supposed to be grateful for what you achieved. Jung talked about this extensively in his work on the second half of life. He said the first half is about ego development, becoming someone, achieving things. But the second half is about individuation, becoming yourself. And that transition requires mourning. Mourning the persona you built so carefully. Mourning the goals that turned out to be empty. Mourning the years you spent becoming someone you're not. Think about who you were before you started performing success. before you learned to want what you're supposed to want, before you adapted yourself to fit expectations. Who were you? What did you actually care about? What made you come alive? And where is that person now? Because if you can't answer that, if that person is buried so deep you can't even find them, then the emptiness makes sense. You're not living your life. You're living a carefully constructed substitute. And part of you knows it. Frankl would say this grief is actually important. It's your psyche trying to redirect you. The emptiness isn't the problem. The emptiness is the signal. It's telling you that what you're doing doesn't align with what actually matters to you. That success without meaning is just sophisticated emptiness, and that you need to stop running from the question and finally answer it. What do I actually want my life to be about? Kierkegaard would call this the despair of possibility. You're aware that you could have lived differently, that there are other versions of you, authentic versions, that never got to exist because you chose safety and success over truth. And that awareness creates a specific kind of pain because you can't unknow it. You can't go back to simply performing success once you've seen that it's a performance. You can only decide what you're going to do with that knowledge. So here we are, at the intersection of success and emptiness, guided by three minds that understood this paradox deeply. And if you've recognized yourself in these patterns, if you've felt that hollow ache despite having everything you're supposed to want, I need you to hear this clearly. You're not broken. You're not ungrateful. You're not weak. You're awake. And awakening, as all three of these thinkers knew, is uncomfortable. Frankl would tell you that what you're feeling is your will to meaning asserting itself. You're a human being, and human beings need more than comfort and achievement. We need purpose. We need something worth living for. And if you've built a life that doesn't provide that, no amount of success will fill the void. The question isn't, why do I feel empty when life is going well? The question is, what kind of life would actually be worth living? What would I commit to if no one was watching? What matters enough to me that I'd be willing to rebuild everything around it? Jung would challenge you to face your midlife crisis, whether you're 30 or 60. Because the midlife crisis isn't about age. It's about the moment when your persona's success can no longer hide your self-starvation. And that moment demands a choice. You can keep performing, keep achieving, keep climbing the ladder while ignoring that it's against the wrong wall. Or you can stop, question everything, and begin the painful, necessary work of individuating, of becoming who you actually are instead of who you've been pretending to be. And Kierkegaard would tell you that this emptiness, painful as it is actually a gift. It's existential despair, and despair is the doorway to authentic existence. Because as long as you were comfortable in your inauthenticity, you had no reason to change. But now you're uncomfortable. Now the performance isn't working. Now you're forced to confront the question, do I want to keep living someone else's idea of success? Or do I want to risk everything to find out what actually matters to me? None of this is easy. Admitting that your successful life feels empty means questioning everything you've built. It means potentially disappointing people. It means possibly walking away from achievements you worked years for. It means facing the terrifying possibility that you've been moving in the wrong direction. And that's why most people don't do it. They live with the emptiness. They medicate it with achievement, distraction, busyness. They die having lived impressively, but never having lived authentically. But you're different, because you're feeling this. You're aware of the emptiness. And that awareness, as painful as it is, means you have a choice. You can keep running, keep achieving, keep hoping that the next success will finally fill the void. Or you can stop, sit with the emptiness, and ask it what it's trying to tell you, because the emptiness isn't the enemy. The emptiness is the messenger. It's telling you that you're capable of more than comfort, that you're meant for something more than impressive achievement, that somewhere beneath the persona and the performance and the carefully constructed success, there's a self that wants to live. And that self doesn't care about your resume. It cares about meaning, about authenticity, about spending your finite time on earth doing something that actually matters to you. So stop trying to fix the emptiness with more success. Stop treating it like a problem to solve. Listen to it. Honor it. Let it guide you toward the question you've been avoiding. What do I actually want my life to be about? Not what should I want? Not what would look good, but what would feel true? What would make this life, this one precious life, worth having lived? That's the work Frankl, Jung, and Kierkegaard all understood. And that's the work waiting for you in the emptiness. Not more achievement, not better performance, but the courageous, uncomfortable, essential work of becoming yourself. Finally, fully. Even if it means letting go of everything you thought success was supposed to be.